I was sitting at a massive mahogany dining table, surrounded by 30 of the most pretentious people in our county, when my daughter-in-law pointed a manicured finger at my husband and ordered him out of her house. I did not raise my voice. I did not cry. I simply stood up, adjusted my jacket, and delivered exactly one sentence. A sentence that made 30 wealthy guests simultaneously lift their dessert plates in absolute stunned silence. But to understand how a retired bank manager ended up serving an eviction notice at a birthday dinner, we have to go back to the beginning of that terrible evening. The driveway of my son David's house was packed with luxury vehicles when Tom and I arrived. It was David's 35th birthday, and his wife Chloe had insisted on throwing an extravagant catered dinner party to celebrate. Their house was a sprawling, oversized suburban mansion. It had fake European columns out front, a massive double door, and the kind of aggressive landscaping that cost a fortune to maintain. Tom parked our modest sedan at the very end of the street because the valet had completely taken over the driveway. Tom turned off the engine and looked down at his hands. For 40 years, my husband owned and operated a local plant nursery. He built his business with his back and his sweat. His hands are calloused rough and deeply stained with soil that no amount of scrubbing can ever fully wash away. He is a gentle, quiet man who never asks for anything and never complains. He adjusted the collar of his suit and gave me a nervous smile. He always felt out of place around Chloe and her country club friends, but he loved our son, so he showed up. I reached over and squeezed his knee, telling him he looked handsome. I spent 35 years working as a regional bank manager. I was used to walking into rooms full of arrogant people who thought they owned the world. I knew how to hold my ground. We walked up the long driveway and entered the house. The noise hit us immediately. A string quartet was playing in the corner of the grand foyer. Waitstaff in crisp white shirts carried silver trays of champagne and appetizers. 30 guests milled around wearing designer clothes and holding expensive drinks. Chloe stood in the center of the living room holding court. She wore a silk dress that easily cost 2 months of Tom's nursery income. When she saw us, her smile tightened. She walked over, giving us both a stiff, performative hug that was mostly for the benefit of her watching friends. She looked at Tom's suit, her eyes doing a quick, dismissive sweep, and told us to find our seats in the dining room before the caterers brought out the first course. She did not introduce us to anyone. She did not offer us a drink. David looked exhausted. My son stood near the kitchen door with a glass of whiskey in his hand. He had dark circles under his eyes and a tense, rigid posture. When he saw us, he forced a smile and came over to hug me, but he smelled strongly of alcohol and stress. I asked him if he was all right, and he just muttered that work was busy, and Chloe wanted everything to be perfect tonight. I looked around the room, making mental calculations. I knew exactly what David earned. I knew the current interest rates, the property taxes on a house this size, and the average cost of a catered event with a live string quartet. My banking instincts hummed with a quiet, persistent warning. The math simply did not add up. When it was time for dinner, the guests moved into the formal dining room. The table was impossibly long, decorated with towering floral centerpieces that blocked the view across the table. Chloe had arranged the seating chart with deliberate cruelty. She and David sat at the head of the table, surrounded by her wealthiest friends. Tom and I were placed at the very opposite end, right next to the swinging kitchen door, where the waitstaff rushed in and out. It was the worst seat in the house. Tom did not complain. He just pulled out my chair for me and smiled, happy to be celebrating his son. The dinner progressed through 3 agonizing courses. The conversation around us consisted entirely of people bragging about their latest luxury vacations, their stock portfolios, and their country club renovations. Chloe dominated the room. Her voice carried over the music as she bragged about the expensive imported wine she was serving and the exclusive caterer she had hired. Every so often she would cast a sharp, critical look down our end of the table, as if waiting for us to embarrass her. The incident happened right before dessert. Chloe stood up and tapped her crystal glass with a silver spoon to make a toast. The room quieted down. She raised her glass to David and gave a speech that was disguised as a compliment, but felt entirely like an insult. She talked about how far David had come from his humble blue-collar roots. She talked about how much she had polished him, how she had introduced him to the finer things in life, and how proud she was that they had built such a magnificent life together. She gestured widely around the dining room, ensuring everyone admired her expensive taste. During her speech, a waiter came around to clear the main course plates. Tom, being the helpful, hard-working man he is, reached across the table to hand the waiter an empty bread plate. It was a simple, polite gesture, but as he pulled his arm back, his suit sleeve caught the edge of a tall, heavy crystal wine glass. The glass tipped over. It shattered against the edge of a serving platter with a loud, ringing crack. Dark red wine spilled across the pristine white linen tablecloth, dripping down onto the imported hardwood floor. The string quartet stopped playing. The dining room went dead silent. Tom immediately stood up, his face flushing red with embarrassment. He grabbed his cloth napkin and started trying to dab at the spilled wine, apologizing profusely to the waiter and to the guests around him. It was a minor accident, a broken glass, a spilled drink. It happens at every dinner party in the world. But Chloe did not treat it like a minor accident. She marched down the length of the long dining table, her heels striking the floor with aggressive force. She stopped right behind Tom, who was still trying to clean up the mess with his napkin. "Look what you did!" she snapped, her voice loud and sharp. The guests stared in uncomfortable silence. Tom looked up, deeply apologetic. "I am so sorry, Chloe. My sleeve just caught the base. I will pay for the glass and I can clean this up." "You cannot clean this up!" she hissed, her face contorting with absolute disgust. "That is a custom-ordered linen cloth, and those glasses are imported crystal. You always do this. You always ruin everything." David stood up from the head of the table. "Chloe, please," he said weakly. "It was an accident. Let it go." "I will not let it go," she shouted, turning her fury back on my husband. She pointed a finger right at Tom's chest. "You do not belong in a house like this. You belong out in the dirt. You are just a clumsy old gardener who tracks mud everywhere you go. You are an embarrassment to me, and you are an embarrassment to your son." I felt the blood freeze in my veins. For 35 years, I managed bank branches in the toughest financial districts. I have dealt with screaming corporate clients, hostile takeovers, and fraudulent investors. I have been threatened, insulted, and undermined by men in suits who thought they could walk all over me. I never backed down from a single one of them, and I was absolutely not going to let this arrogant, cruel woman speak to my husband this way. Tom just stood there, taking the abuse. His head lowered the stained napkin in his calloused hands. He was trying to keep the peace for David's sake. I stood up. I pushed my chair back deliberately, letting the wooden legs scrape loudly against the hardwood floor. The harsh sound made Chloe snap her head toward me. I smoothed the front of my jacket, looked her dead in the eye, and stepped in front of Tom. "Do not ever speak to my husband that way again," I said. My voice was completely calm, completely even, and terrifyingly cold. Chloe let out a harsh, mocking laugh. "Or what, Barbara? You are going to lecture me in my own dining room? I am sick of pretending to tolerate you two. You come in here, you break my things, you embarrass me in front of my friends. I am done. Take your husband and get out of my house, right now." The guests were entirely still. Some looked away, deeply uncomfortable. Others watched with eager, hungry curiosity. David was frozen at the other end of the table, looking utterly defeated, too cowardly to defend the father who raised him. I did not move toward the door. I did not grab my purse. I stood perfectly still, looking at this woman who thought she held all the power. I let the silence stretch for 5 agonizing seconds, making sure every single person in that room was hanging on my next word. "It is actually my house, Chloe," I said, clearly letting my voice carry all the way to the string quartet in the corner. Chloe scoffed, crossing her arms. "What are you talking about? You are delusional." I took a slow, measured step forward. "I am not delusional, and this is not your house. In fact, if you ask your guests to lift their dessert plates, they will find some very interesting reading material. Your 30-day eviction notice is currently sitting under your dessert plate, Chloe, and a copy of the legal deed transfer is sitting under everyone else's." Chloe froze. The blood drained from her face. For a moment, nobody moved. Then the man sitting closest to me slowly lifted his porcelain dessert plate. Underneath it was a neatly folded, perfectly legal document printed on heavy stock paper. A woman across the table did the same. Suddenly, the entire dining room was filled with the sound of rustling paper as 30 wealthy elite guests pulled out the legal documents I had paid the catering staff $200 to slip under the plates during the main course. "What is this?" someone whispered. "This says the property belongs to Barbara Holdings, LLC," another guest muttered, reading the bold print at the top of the page. Chloe snatched the paper from the table, her eyes scanning the legal jargon. Her hands began to shake. "David!" she shrieked, turning to my son. "David, what did she do? Tell them this is a lie. Tell them this is our house." David did not answer. He slowly sank back into his chair and buried his face in his hands. The guests stared at the documents, then stared at Chloe. the illusion of her perfect, wealthy life crumbling right before their eyes. The imported wine, the crystal glasses, the massive house, it was all a spectacular, fraudulent mirage, and I had just turned the lights on. But to understand how we got to this dining room, how a retired bank manager and a quiet nursery owner ended up holding the deed to $1 million mansion, and why I decided to publicly annihilate my own daughter-in-law, we have to go back. We have to rewind exactly 21 days to a quiet Tuesday morning at the local pharmacy, and the moment a declined debit card blew my entire world wide open. Exactly 21 days before I stood in that dining room and delivered an eviction notice to my daughter-in-law, my husband called me from the local pharmacy. It was a perfectly ordinary Tuesday morning, the kind of morning where the sun was shining, the coffee was fresh, and the biggest concern on my mind was whether it was going to rain on my hydrangeas. I answered the phone with a smile, expecting Tom to ask if we needed milk or eggs on his way home. Instead, his voice came through the receiver, sounding small, tight, and profoundly embarrassed. He told me he was standing at the pharmacy counter trying to pick up his monthly heart medication. The pharmacist had run his debit card twice, and both times the machine had declined the transaction. Tom is a man of deep, quiet pride. He has worked every single day since he was 16 years old, building his plant nursery from a single greenhouse into a thriving local business. The idea of holding up a line of people because he could not pay for a $30 copay was horrifying to him. He whispered into the phone asking if I could log into our joint checking account and see if the bank had put a fraud hold on his card. He assumed it was just a security glitch. We had never been short on money. We had spent decades living below our means, saving diligently, so our golden years would be entirely free of financial anxiety. I told him not to worry, that I would transfer a few $100s from our primary retirement savings into the checking account, just to clear the block, and that I would call the bank to sort out the fraud alert. I spoke to him in the soothing, capable tone I had used for 35 years, managing branch operations. I hung up the phone, took a sip of my coffee, and walked into my home office to fix what I thought was a minor technical inconvenience. I sat down at my desk, opened my laptop, and navigated to our secure banking portal. I typed in my credentials, answered the security question, and waited for the dashboard to load. I expected to see our checking account with its usual modest balance alongside our primary retirement portfolio. That retirement account was our lifeblood. It held the proceeds from when Tom finally sold the commercial land his nursery sat on, combined with my executive pension and our joint investments. By my last calculation, that specific account should have held just over $400,000. The screen loaded, the numbers populated on the bright white background. I stared at the screen. I blinked, took off my reading glasses, cleaned the lenses on the hem of my sweater, and put them back on. I leaned closer to the monitor, waiting for my brain to correct what my eyes were seeing. The balance in our primary retirement account was not $400,000. The balance was $814. For a span of perhaps 10 seconds, I experienced a complete suspension of reality. My heart hammered against my ribs with such violent force I could hear the pulse rushing in my ears. The air in my home office suddenly felt too thin to breathe. I tried to convince myself that I had logged into the wrong portal, that the bank was doing system maintenance, that a display error was truncating the numbers. But I knew better. I knew the architecture of this banking system inside and out. I knew the font, the layout, the precise way available balances were calculated and displayed. This was not a glitch. The money was gone. Any normal person might have screamed. A normal mother might have broken down into hysterical tears, panicked, or called the police in a state of absolute terror. But I did not scream, and I did not cry. When you spend 3.5 decades in the banking industry, you develop a certain kind of psychological armor. You learn how to detach your emotions from the numbers on a ledger. I had personally audited accounts where millions of dollars had vanished. I had sat across desks from weeping widows who had been scammed and arrogant executives who had been caught embezzling. I knew how financial bleeding worked. I knew that money never simply disappears. It leaves a trail. It leaves footprints. I took a slow, deep breath, forcing my heart rate to steady. I picked up my computer mouse and clicked on the Transaction History tab. I filtered the search parameters to show the last 6 months of activity, organized by withdrawal amount from highest to lowest. The spreadsheet populated instantly, and the betrayal laid itself bare in neat chronological rows. There were no mysterious ATM withdrawals from foreign countries. There were no suspicious debit card charges at electronics stores. There was only a steady, escalating series of massive outbound wire transfers. The bleeding had begun 6 months ago. The first transfer was for $5,000. 3 weeks later, a wire for $12,000. The next month, the amounts grew more aggressive: $25,000, $40,000, $60,000. It was a systematic, deliberate draining of our life savings executed with the precision of someone who knew exactly how much liquidity we had and exactly how to extract it without triggering internal bank alarms. My eyes darted to the authorization column. To execute a wire transfer of this magnitude from a high-yield retirement account, the bank requires strict verification. They require either dual signature authorization from both account holders, or they require a verified legal proxy. I clicked on the digital receipt for the largest transfer, an $80,000 wire processed just 3 weeks ago. I opened the attached authorization document. There, staring back at me from the bright screen, was the signature of my only son, David. Beneath his signature was a digital scan of a legal document, a limited power of attorney. The memory hit me with sickening clarity. 5 years ago, Tom and I had finally taken our dream vacation, a 4-week cruise through the Mediterranean, to celebrate our 40th wedding anniversary. Because we were going to be out of the country for an extended period, and because Tom had some minor health issues at the time, we had visited our lawyer. We drew up a limited power of attorney granting David the legal authority to handle our medical and financial affairs if we were incapacitated or unreachable in an emergency. We had handed that document to our son because we trusted him implicitly. He was our boy. We had sacrificed, scrimped, and saved to put him through college debt-free. When we returned from Europe safe and sound, I had asked David to shred the document. He promised me he had put it through the cross-cut shredder in his office. He lied. He kept it. And 6 months ago, he walked into a branch of my former bank, presented that active legal document to a junior manager who did not know my face, and used it to bypass all security protocols. He had weaponized our trust to rob us blind. I sat back in my chair. The physical pain of the betrayal was so acute, it felt like a knife twisting in my stomach. My son, my own flesh and blood, had systematically stolen the security Tom and I had broken our backs to build. And for what? The answer was glaringly obvious. My mind flashed with images of Chloe, the constant barrage of social media posts showing her standing next to a brand new luxury SUV. The posts from the exclusive country club complaining about the quality of the tennis courts. The photos of her modeling imported designer handbags, sipping vintage champagne, and bragging about their upcoming kitchen remodel. For the past year, I had wondered how David was affording it all on his salary. I had assumed Chloe had family money, or that David had received a massive corporate promotion he was keeping quiet about. The truth was far more sinister. They were living the lives of millionaires, and they were funding it by draining the blood from my husband's calloused hands. Every time Tom came home exhausted, his back aching from loading bags of soil, his knees stiff from walking the nursery grounds, David and Chloe were dining at 5-star restaurants using his money. Every time I clipped coupons or passed on buying a new winter coat because I wanted to be careful with our fixed income, my son was authorizing another massive wire transfer to fund his wife's vanity. A lesser woman would have stopped there. A lesser woman would have picked up the phone, called her son, demanded an explanation, and begged for the money back. I am not a lesser woman. I am an auditor, and auditors do not stop until they find the bottom of the ledger. I did not call David. I did not shed a single tear. I leaned closer to the monitor and focused entirely on the destination routing numbers attached to the wire transfers. I noticed a pattern. The first few wires, the smaller ones, had indeed gone directly into David and Chloe's joint checking account. I could see the receiving bank routing information. But as the amounts grew larger, the destination changed. The massive wires, the $40,000, the $60,000, the $80,000 transfers were not going to a personal checking account. They were being routed to a commercial business account. The receiving entity was listed on the wire receipt as Apex Premier Holdings, LLC. Why would David be sending my retirement funds to a commercial holding company? Was he paying off a massive hidden debt? Was he secretly investing our money, thinking he could double it and put it back before we noticed? I opened a new browser window and navigated to the state government's corporate registry database. This is public information if you know exactly how to search for it. I typed the name of the holding company into the search bar and pulled up their annual filing documents. I scanned the corporate registration page, looking past the legal jargon and the registered office addresses. I scrolled down to the section listing the executive officers and managing members of the LLC. I found the name of the registered agent. I found the name of the chief executive officer, Justin Miller. I stared at the name until the letters seemed to burn themselves into my retinas. Justin Miller was not a random debt collector. He was not an anonymous investment broker. Justin Miller was Chloe's older brother. The air in my office turned absolutely frigid. This was not a story of a desperate son making a terrible, impulsive mistake to pay off a credit card bill. This was not a momentary lapse of judgment by a man trying to keep his demanding wife happy. This was a coordinated, calculated, systematic financial extraction. My son and my daughter-in-law were funneling our entire life savings directly into a shell corporation owned by her brother. They were moving the money out of their personal accounts to hide it, using Justin's business as a laundering mechanism to turn our hard-earned retirement into untraceable cash for their luxury lifestyle. My phone rang on the desk. It was Tom calling back from the pharmacy, asking if the transfer had gone through, so he could pay for the medication that kept his heart beating. I picked up the phone. My voice was perfectly smooth, betraying absolutely nothing of the war that had just been declared. I told Tom that the bank was having a routing issue, but I had used my personal credit card to pay for his prescription over the phone with the pharmacist. I told him to pick up his medicine, drive home safely, and that I loved him. I hung up the phone. I looked at the zero balance on my screen. They thought I was just a sweet, ignorant old grandmother sitting quietly in the suburbs. They thought I would eventually notice the missing money cry about it and accept whatever pathetic excuse David offered, because mothers always forgive their sons. They thought they could strip us down to our bones and walk away rich. They had no idea that they had just invited a predator into their own financial ecosystem. I did not close the laptop. I opened a new spreadsheet. I began documenting every routing number, every signature, and every timestamp. I was not going to cry over my stolen retirement. I was going to systematically dismantle their entire lives. The safety of a fully paid-off home is a feeling you carry in your bones. For 12 years, Tom and I had lived without the shadow of a mortgage hanging over our heads. We had celebrated our final payment with a quiet dinner, raising a glass of cheap wine, to the sheer relief of knowing that no matter what happened in the world, the roof over our heads belonged entirely to us. Tom had laid the oak hardwood floors in our living room with his own 2 hands. He had planted the climbing roses that framed our front porch. This house was not just an asset on a ledger. It was the fortress we had built to protect us in our old age. When a thief realizes they have successfully drained a reservoir of liquid cash, they rarely stop there. Greed is a disease that demands to be fed. My realization that $400,000 was missing from our retirement accounts was immediately followed by a much darker, much colder calculation. If David and Chloe were bold enough to steal cash, they would absolutely be bold enough to target equity. I closed the banking portal and navigated to the county clerk public records database. The interface was clunky and outdated, but I had used it thousands of times during my career to verify property titles for commercial loans. I typed in my legal name and Tom's legal name, holding my breath, as the search engine processed the query. The results loaded on the screen, and the last remnants of my maternal instinct shattered into dust. There, registered just 4 months prior, was a deed of trust. Attached to our property address was a home equity line of credit. The principal amount approved and drawn was $250,000. My chest seized. I clicked on the public summary of the document, reading the cold legal text that confirmed the absolute worst. David had gone back to the bank. He had presented that same unrevoked limited power of attorney. He had signed his name on our behalf, placing a massive $250,000 lien against our home. He had extracted the entire equity of the house we had worked decades to own outright, turning our sanctuary into a giant piggy bank for his wife's luxury lifestyle. But the horror did not stop at the theft of our equity. I dug deeper into the loan status through my own banking contacts, making a few quiet phone calls to former colleagues under the guise of inquiring about current interest rates. What I discovered made the blood in my veins run ice cold. David had drawn the maximum amount of $250,000 immediately upon approval, but a home equity line of credit requires monthly interest payments. If you do not pay the monthly minimum, the loan goes into default. If the loan goes into default, the bank has the legal right to foreclose on the property to recover their funds. David had missed the last 3 monthly payments. He had changed the mailing address on the loan file to a private post office box so that Tom and I would never see the late notices or the warning letters. My son had drained the equity from our home, spent the money, and then completely abandoned the debt. He was deliberately allowing the bank to push our house into pre-foreclosure. He was perfectly willing to let his elderly father be thrown out onto the street, his belongings packed into garbage bags by county sheriffs, just so he and his wife could continue to live in a mansion. The sheer breathtaking callousness of it settled over me like a heavy winter blanket. They were not just stealing from us, they were erasing us. I needed to see the physical documents. I needed to know exactly how they had bypassed the stringent underwriting protocols required for a loan of that magnitude. Banks do not simply hand over $250,000 based on a 5-year-old power of attorney without a mountain of secondary verification. Someone had to have signed off on the closing documents. Someone had to have verified the legal identities of the signers. I stood up from my desk, went into my bedroom, and opened my closet. I bypassed my comfortable retirement sweaters and pulled out one of my old corporate suits, a sharp-tailored navy blazer and matching trousers. I put on my pearls. I pinned my hair back perfectly. I applied my makeup with the precision of a soldier putting on war paint. When I looked in the mirror, I did not see a heartbroken mother or a betrayed grandmother. I saw a regional bank manager preparing to audit a fraudulent branch. I drove to the lending office of the financial institution that had issued the loan. I walked through the double glass doors, my heels clicking sharply against the polished marble floor. I approached the reception desk and asked to speak with a loan officer regarding a recent equity line taken out on my property. A young man in a slightly oversized suit escorted me to his cubicle. He offered me coffee, which I politely declined. I sat perfectly straight in the guest chair, maintaining a pleasant but commanding expression. I told him I was organizing my tax documents for my accountant and needed a complete, unredacted copy of my recent loan origination file, including all signature pages and disbursement records. Because I am the legal owner of the property and presented my identification, he had no reason to deny my request. He typed into his computer, sent the file to the branch printer, and handed me a thick stack of warm, freshly printed paper. I thanked him, smiled graciously, and told him I just needed a few moments to review the pages to ensure my accountant had everything required. He turned back to his computer, leaving me to my reading. I flipped through the standard disclosures, the interest rate agreements, and the property valuation appraisals. Then I reached the final closing documents, the signature pages. There was David's signature scrawled on the line representing Tom and me as our attorney, in fact. I expected to see that. What I did not expect to see was the document immediately following it. In real estate transactions, when a power of attorney is used to encumber a property with debt, the signatures must be notarized. A legally commissioned notary public must stamp the document swearing under penalty of perjury that they have verified the identities of the signers and that the documents were executed legally and without coercion. I looked at the blue ink of the notary stamp pressed firmly onto the bottom of the page. I looked at the cursive signature of the notary public. The name signed on the legal document was Chloe. My daughter-in-law had notarized her own husband's fraudulent loan documents. I sat in the quiet hum of the bank lobby staring at her signature, and I almost laughed out loud at the sheer staggering arrogance of it. Chloe was a commissioned notary, likely a credential. She picked up years ago for some administrative job before she decided she was too wealthy to work. In her greed and her absolute certainty that Tom and I were too stupid to ever uncover their scheme, she had taken the ultimate shortcut. She had illegally acted as the notary for a transaction that directly benefited her own household, forging the verification process to secure $250,000. The rules of the game shifted instantly in my mind. Before this moment, I was dealing with a deeply painful civil dispute. A son abusing a legal proxy to drain accounts is a terrible thing, but prosecuting it can be messy, lengthy, and complicated by family law. But a notary public falsifying a real estate loan document to extract funds from a federally insured bank, that is not a civil dispute. That is bank fraud. That is wire fraud. That is a federal crime punishable by severe mandatory prison sentences. Chloe had just handed me the key to her own destruction. She had wrapped a federal indictment around her own neck, tied the knot, and left the rope resting perfectly in my hands. I kept my breathing steady. I turned the page to the disbursement record. I needed to see exactly where this specific $250,000 had gone. The document showed the funds had not been sent to David and Chloe's personal accounts. Just like the retirement money, the entire lump sum of the loan had been wired out on the day of closing to a commercial receiving account. The destination was Apex Premier Holdings LLC, Justin's company, Chloe's brother. I thanked the young loan officer for his time, placed the documents carefully into my leather briefcase, and walked out of the bank into the bright afternoon sun. The puzzle pieces were rapidly assembling themselves into a massive, terrifying picture. Justin was presenting himself to the country club world as a highly successful luxury commercial real estate developer. He drove a sports car, wore bespoke suits, and threw money around like it was water. He claimed his firm was developing high-end commercial properties and exclusive residential communities. But sitting in my car, looking at the wire transfers linking my stolen retirement and my stolen home equity directly to his holding company, the reality of his business became glaringly obvious. Justin was not a successful real estate developer. Justin was running a Ponzi scheme. Apex Premier Holdings LLC was a black hole. Justin was funding his fake luxury empire and paying out early fake returns by sucking in capital from anywhere he could get it. Chloe and David were not just buying designer dresses and throwing extravagant parties. They were funneling massive amounts of stolen capital into Justin's fraudulent business, likely in exchange for exorbitant fake interest payouts that allowed them to maintain their wealthy facade. They were bleeding my husband's lifelong labor dry to prop up a house of cards. They thought my money would float their fake empire indefinitely. They thought they could extract our equity, skip the payments, let the bank toss us out onto the street, and never face a single consequence because we were just foolish old people who would quietly accept our ruin. I started the engine of my car. I did not drive home. I pulled out of the bank parking lot and merged onto the highway, heading toward the affluent commercial district on the other side of the county. I had the printed proof of my son's theft. I had the physical evidence of my daughter-in-law's federal fraud. Now I needed to look the architect of this Ponzi scheme in the eye. It was time to pay Justin a visit. The commercial park housing Apex Premier Holdings was a monument to superficial wealth. It sat on the edge of the county's most expensive zip code, surrounded by manicured lawns and fountains that sprayed chemically treated water into the afternoon air. The building itself was all glass and steel, designed to reflect the California sun and intimidate anyone without a six-figure income. I parked my modest sedan between a gleaming Porsche and a pristine Range Rover. I sat behind the wheel for a moment, checking my reflection in the rearview mirror. I wore my softest cardigan, a floral scarf that Tom had bought me for our anniversary, and comfortable walking shoes. I deliberately carried an oversized, slightly worn leather handbag. I looked exactly like what I needed to be: a sweet, naive, slightly confused grandmother with more money than sense. When you walk into a shark's den, you do not carry a harpoon. You carry bait. I pushed open the heavy glass doors and stepped into the lobby. It smelled of expensive cologne and freshly printed paper. A receptionist with perfectly styled hair and a headset smiled at me, though her eyes did a quick, dismissive assessment of my cardigan. I approached her desk, adopting a slight flutter in my voice, a carefully manufactured hesitancy. I told her I was Barbara David's mother and Chloe's mother-in-law. I said I was hoping to speak with Justin if he had a moment, mentioning that David had been talking so much about the wonderful investments Justin was managing for them. I let a small, hopeful smile play across my lips, adding that Tom and I were looking to move some of our retirement funds into something with a better return than our boring old savings accounts. The receptionist's demeanor changed instantly. The dismissal vanished, replaced by the eager, predatory politeness reserved for potential marks. She picked up her phone, spoke in hushed, urgent tones, and within 90 seconds, Justin Miller himself emerged from the double doors leading to the executive suites. Justin was exactly the kind of man I had spent 35 years declining commercial loans for. He was young, perhaps early 30s, wearing a bespoke suit that fit a little too tightly across the shoulders. His teeth were unnaturally white, and his smile was a practiced weapon designed to disarm and disorient. He walked toward me with both hands extended, projecting an aura of overwhelming, unearned confidence. "Barbara," he exclaimed, his voice booming across the quiet lobby, "it is so wonderful to finally meet you. Chloe talks about you all the time. Come in, come in. Let me show you the operation." He placed a guiding hand on the small of my back, ushering me through the double doors into his private office. It was a corner suite with floor-to-ceiling windows dominated by a massive mahogany desk and abstract art that looked expensive but meaningless. He offered me sparkling water, which I accepted, taking a delicate sip and looking around the room with wide, appreciative eyes. I played the part perfectly. I complimented the view. I told him how proud I was of how well he was doing. I let him talk, letting his ego fill the space between us. "I understand you and Tom are looking to optimize your portfolio," Justin said, leaning back in his leather chair and steepling his fingers. He spoke with the slick, practiced cadence of a timeshare salesman. "David mentioned you had some capital tied up in low-yield traditional accounts. In today's market, Barbara, that is essentially losing money to inflation. You need your assets working for you, generating passive income." I nodded slowly, adjusting my glasses. That is exactly what David was telling us. I let my voice waver just a fraction. "He said you have been doing such incredible things for him and Chloe." To be honest, Justin, Tom, and I are a little overwhelmed by it all. David mentioned you are managing their investments, and we just thought, well, since you are family, perhaps you could help us understand how it all works. We have a sizable nest egg, and we want to make sure it is protected. The word sizable hung in the air, a drop of blood in the water. Justin's eyes visibly sharpened. The greed was so palpable I could almost smell it. "I would be absolutely honored to help you and Tom," he said smoothly. He opened a desk drawer and pulled out a glossy, professionally bound folder. He slid it across the desk toward me. "What we do here at Apex is exclusive. We deal in high-barrier commercial acquisitions. We pool investor capital to purchase distressed luxury properties, renovate them, and flip them for massive margins. The returns are exponential compared to traditional banking." I opened the folder. It was a masterclass in financial fiction. The pages were filled with complex charts, projected yield graphs, and photos of stunning commercial properties that I strongly suspected Apex Premier Holdings did not actually own. It was all smoke and mirrors designed to dazzle unsophisticated investors into handing over their cash. "This looks very complicated," I murmured, trailing a finger over a particularly meaningless pie chart. "David said you were generating amazing returns for them. He mentioned you were managing some of the funds he recently transferred. I just want to make sure we would be getting the same family treatment." Justin laughed, a rich, hearty sound that grated against my nerves. "Absolutely. In fact, David's recent capital injection allowed us to secure a prime piece of real estate just last week. He is positioned to see a 20% return by the end of the quarter." I kept my expression perfectly pleasant, even as my stomach turned. The capital injection he was referring to was the stolen equity from my home. Justin was sitting across from me, bragging about how much money he was making off the funds he had helped my son steal. But I needed more. I needed concrete, undeniable proof that the money sitting in Apex Premier Holdings was directly tied to the fraudulent home equity line of credit. I needed him to connect the dots out loud on paper. "That is wonderful to hear," I said, leaning forward slightly. "But you know Justin Tom gets so anxious about money. He is a bit old-fashioned. He worries that David is stretching himself too thin with that big, beautiful house of theirs. I was hoping that if we invested with you, maybe the returns could help them out a little bit. Ensure they are comfortable." Justin waved his hand dismissively, his arrogance overriding whatever meager caution he possessed. "Barbara, you do not need to worry about David and Chloe. They are completely taken care of. In fact, the investment strategy we set up for them is specifically designed to handle their overhead." He leaned closer, lowering his voice in a conspiratorial whisper, thrilled to be showing off his financial brilliance to an old woman he thought he could easily manipulate. "Between us, David got a little over his head with the mortgage on that property. The market shifted, and the variable rate spiked. They were actually facing a bit of a liquidity crisis a few months ago. The bank was getting aggressive. But that is the beauty of our partnership. David moved that dormant equity over to me, and I used it to secure their position. We bailed them out. The returns from Apex are currently covering their mortgage arrears. They are totally fine." The room went profoundly silent, save for the hum of the air conditioning. Justin had just handed me the final piece of the puzzle. He had not just admitted to receiving the funds. He had explicitly confirmed that the stolen equity was actively being used to pay off David and Chloe's personal debts and fund their lifestyle. He was commingling stolen assets to prop up their failing personal finances while simultaneously running a commercial Ponzi scheme. And more devastatingly, he had just confirmed David's total complicity. Until this moment, a tiny, fragile part of my mother's heart had harbored a desperate hope. A hope that David had been coerced, that Chloe had manipulated the paperwork without his full knowledge, that my son had perhaps made a terrible mistake in a moment of weakness and was now trapped in a situation he could not control. But Justin's bragging shattered that illusion completely. David knew exactly what he was doing. He was drowning in debt from his oversized mansion. He was facing foreclosure because he could not afford the life he was pretending to live. And instead of downsizing, instead of asking for help, instead of facing the consequences of his own financial irresponsibility, he had chosen to rob his parents. He had chosen to drain the equity from the house where he grew up, knowing full well it would leave his elderly father destitute simply to save his own pride. I was not a victim. He was a willing, active participant in our destruction. I looked down at the glossy prospectus in my hands. The anger that had been simmering in my chest crystallized into something hard, cold, and diamond-sharp. I was no longer a mother trying to understand her son's mistake. I was an auditor closing the books on a fraudulent account. "This is incredibly reassuring, Justin," I said, my voice steady and warm. "You have no idea how much better this makes me feel. Tom and I have a significant amount in municipal bonds that will be maturing next week. I think we would very much like to move those funds into Apex." Justin's eyes widened. He could practically see the dollar signs hovering in the air between us. "That is a brilliant decision, Barbara. I can have the onboarding paperwork drafted this afternoon." "Oh, no rush," I smiled, slipping the glossy folder into my oversized leather handbag. "I will take this home and review it with Tom. We will need to sit down and figure out exactly how much we want to transfer. But I am so glad we had this talk. It really clarified everything for me." I stood up, smoothing my cardigan. Justin scrambled to his feet, eager to escort his newest mark to the door. He walked me through the lobby, thanking me profusely, telling me again how much Chloe loved having me as a mother-in-law. I maintained my pleasant, bewildered smile all the way to my car. I did not drop the facade until I was safely inside my vehicle, the doors locked and the engine running. I pulled the prospectus out of my bag and tossed it onto the passenger seat. It was a physical piece of evidence, a documented connection between Justin's fraudulent company and my stolen funds. I had the wire transfers. I had the forged notary stamp. I had the admission of commingled assets. I gripped the steering wheel, staring out at the manicured lawns of the commercial park. The sun was beginning to set, casting long, dark shadows across the pristine asphalt. I thought about Tom, currently at home, tending to his roses, blissfully unaware that the house he loved was currently carrying $250,000 lien. I thought about David, my son, who had looked me in the eye at Sunday dinners for the past 6 months, knowing he was systematically dismantling our security to fund his wife's vanity. A mother's love is a powerful thing. It can forgive almost anything. It can excuse failures, overlook flaws, and weather endless disappointments. But when a child weaponizes that love, when they use the absolute trust of their parents as a tool to enact calculated, devastating harm, that love does not just break. It calcifies. It turns into an armor that cannot be pierced. David had made his choice. He had chosen his pride over our survival. He had chosen his wife's country club status over his father's peace of mind. He had decided that our decades of hard work were nothing more than a resource for him to exploit. I put the car in gear and pulled out of the parking lot, merging onto the highway as the sky turned a bruised, dusky purple. I was not going to rescue him. I was not going to call him and beg for an explanation. I was not going to give him the opportunity to lie to cry or to manipulate my maternal instincts. He had built a house of cards on a foundation of theft and fraud, and I was going to systematically dismantle every single pillar holding it up. I drove toward the city center, my mind racing with legal statutes, banking regulations, and property laws. I needed to move fast. I needed to move ruthlessly. I was going to secure my assets, protect my husband, and teach my son the most devastating financial lesson of his life. I decided not to save him. I decided to conquer him. The morning air was crisp and completely still when I poured my first cup of black coffee. I sat at my kitchen island looking out the large bay window that faced our backyard. The thick file of evidence I had compiled the previous night was safely locked away in a fireproof floor safe beneath my desk. I had not slept a single minute. My mind had been running complex financial algorithms, piecing together the exact legal mechanisms my son and his wife had used to hollow out our life savings. But looking out that window, the world seemed deceptively peaceful. Tom was already outside. He was kneeling in the damp soil of his prized rose garden, wearing his faded denim overalls and thick canvas gloves. The morning dew clung to his gray hair. He was carefully pruning the bushes, his hands moving with the gentle, practiced rhythm of a man who had spent 4 decades nurturing living things. He looked so incredibly content. He had absolutely no idea that our son had secretly mortgaged the very ground he was kneeling on. I watched my husband work, feeling a surge of protective fury, so intense it actually made my fingertips numb. I took a slow sip of my coffee, letting the bitter heat ground me. The crunch of expensive tires on our gravel driveway shattered the quiet morning. A pristine white luxury sport utility vehicle rolled to a stop right next to my modest sedan. The driver's side door swung open, and Chloe stepped out. She was dressed like she was attending a fashion shoot rather than visiting her in-laws on a Wednesday morning. She wore tight designer athletic wear that had clearly never seen the inside of a gym oversized sunglasses, and she carried a leather tote bag that cost more than my first car. I set my coffee mug down on the granite counter. When you prepare to trap a predator, you do not lock the cage door before they are entirely inside. You leave it wide open. You put down fresh bait. You make them feel completely safe. I arranged my face into a mask of pleasant, welcoming surprise and walked to the front door. Chloe breezed past me into the foyer, bringing with her a cloud of heavy floral perfume and the clinking sound of the heavy gold bracelet stacked on her wrist. She gave the air next to my cheek a loud, performative kiss. "Barbara, it is so wonderful to see you," she said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "I was just in the neighborhood looking at some imported tile samples and realized I had not seen you in weeks." I invited her into the kitchen and offered her a seat at the island. She climbed onto the bar stool, carefully adjusting her expensive clothes, and placed her iced coffee on a coaster. For the first 10 minutes, she dominated the conversation with rapid-fire complaints about her incredibly difficult life. She talked about the terrible service at her country club, the delays with her interior designer, and the exhausting burden of managing her social calendar. I sat across from her, nodding politely, murmuring sympathetic agreements at exactly the right intervals. I looked at the diamond rings glittering on her fingers. I thought about the forged notary stamp pressed onto a $250,000 federal loan document. Then the conversation shifted. Chloe sighed heavily, placing a perfectly manicured hand against her forehead in a gesture of profound distress. "Honestly, Barbara, the main reason I wanted to stop by is that I am just so worried about David," she said, dropping her voice into a conspiratorial whisper. "He is under so much pressure right now. His 35th birthday is next week, and I am trying to throw him the magnificent dinner party he deserves. Plus, we are right in the middle of finalizing the contracts for our kitchen remodel. But money is just so unbelievably tight right now." I watched her lips move. Money is tight. The sheer staggering audacity of the statement echoed in my kitchen. She was sitting in my house drinking her coffee, complaining about cash flow after she and her brother had systematically drained over $400,000 from my retirement portfolio. They had stolen the equity from the walls surrounding us, funneled it into a fraudulent commercial real estate scheme, and she had the absolute nerve to sit at my counter and pretend they were struggling to make ends meet. "It breaks my heart to see him so stressed." Chloe continued, completely oblivious to the cold calculation happening behind my eyes. "He works so hard to provide for us. We were looking at our budget last night and we realized we are going to have to cancel the caterers for his birthday party. We might even have to halt the kitchen construction. He is devastated." I tilted my head, adopting a look of deep maternal concern. "Oh, Chloe, that sounds terrible. I hate to think of David being so stressed on his milestone birthday. What exactly do you need?" She leaned forward, her eyes gleaming with sudden predatory hope. The hook had been dropped and she was swimming straight for it. "Well, David is too proud to ever ask you himself," she said smoothly. "But we were talking and we thought, since you and Tom are so comfortable, perhaps we could discuss an early inheritance. Just a lump sum to help us get over this temporary hump. $50,000 would cover the rest of the party vendors and secure the imported marble for the kitchen islands. It would mean the world to David." $50,000. She thought my accounts were endless. She thought I was a senile, bottomless bank vault that existed solely to fund her vanity. She did not know that my account balance currently sat at $814. I took a deep breath, preparing to deliver my lines perfectly. But before I could speak, Chloe turned her head and looked out the large bay window toward the backyard. Tom had stood up from the rose beds. He was wiping sweat from his forehead with the back of his canvas glove. His denim overalls were smeared with damp topsoil, and his old comfortable boots were caked in mud. He was smiling at a cardinal that had landed on the birdbath. Chloe let out a sharp, derisive little laugh. Her nose wrinkled in pure disgust. "I really hope Tom plans on buying a new suit before the birthday dinner next week," she said, her tone suddenly dropping its fake sweetness to reveal the cruelty beneath. "I am inviting some very important people from the tennis association. David and I have a reputation to maintain in our neighborhood. I just really do not want my friends seeing my father-in-law looking like the hired help. The silence in my kitchen was absolute. I looked at this woman. I looked at the shallow, greedy, fraudulent shell of a human being sitting in my home, insulting the man who had worked his hands to the bone to provide the life she was currently stealing. A hot, violent surge of rage flared in my chest, so powerful it tasted like copper in my mouth. For one dangerous second, I wanted to reach across the granite island, grab her by her expensive silk collar, and drag her out of my house by her hair. But anger is loud and loud is careless. I did not need to be loud. I needed to be lethal. I forced the rage down into a tight, dark box in my mind. I locked it. I channeled 35 years of corporate banking discipline. I let a warm, gracious smile spread across my face. "You are completely right, Chloe," I said softly. "Tom is much too humble for his own good. And you and David certainly deserve a kitchen that matches your lifestyle. I think an early inheritance is a wonderful idea. I would be more than happy to provide the $50,000. Chloe gasped, clapping her hands together in genuine delight. "Oh, Barbara, really, you have no idea how much this will help us. You are the best mother-in-law in the world." I kept smiling. "There is just one minor administrative detail we need to handle first," I said, standing up from my stool. "Because of federal banking regulations regarding massive cash transfers and the strict tax laws governing gifts over the annual exemption limit, I cannot just write you a personal check for $50,000. It would trigger an audit on both of our accounts." Chloe frowned slightly, her limited financial literacy immediately overwhelmed by the bureaucratic terminology. "An audit. But we need the money by Friday to pay the catering deposits." "Do not worry," I reassured her smoothly. "I spent my entire career managing these exact types of transactions. There is a very simple legal workaround. We just need to classify the transfer as an internal family loan rather than a taxable gift. It is purely a paper formality to satisfy the Internal Revenue Service. Once the fiscal year closes, I will simply write off the balance and the money becomes yours free and clear. You just need to sign a standard compliance form so my wealth manager can release the funds from my trust account." Chloe visibly relaxed. The promise of immediate cash completely blinded her to the mechanics of the transaction. She nodded eagerly. "Of course. Whatever paperwork you need, I will sign it right now." I walked into my home office. My heart was beating with a steady, triumphant rhythm. Late last night, anticipating exactly this kind of greedy maneuver from them, I had sat at my computer and drafted a very specific legal document. It was formatted to look exactly like standard boring bank boilerplate. It had official-looking borders, dense paragraphs of financial legalese, and a prominent signature block at the bottom. But it was not a tax compliance form. It was a debt acknowledgement and promissory note. I had carefully embedded specific ironclad clauses within the dense text. The document explicitly stated that the undersigned parties legally acknowledged receipt of all prior wire transfers originating from my primary retirement account over the past 6 months. It listed the exact routing numbers. It listed the total stolen amount down to the final penny. Furthermore, the document legally classified that entire sum, along with the $250,000 from the home equity line of credit, as an active callable debt owed directly and entirely to me. It included a clause stating the debt was payable upon demand, and any default would result in the immediate forfeiture of all personal assets held by the signers. I printed the document on heavy premium stock paper to give it an extra layer of bureaucratic authority. I picked up my favorite heavy fountain pen from my desk. I walked back into the kitchen and placed the document on the granite island right in front of her. "This is the internal ledger agreement," I said smoothly, tapping the bottom of the page. "It just verifies the flow of capital from my accounts to yours for the compliance officers. You just need to sign as the primary recipient, and I will initiate the liquidation of the bonds this afternoon." Chloe did not read a single word of the text. She did not ask to consult a lawyer. She did not even glance at the itemized list of wire transfers buried in the second paragraph. Her eyes were fixed entirely on the blank signature line, driven by an insatiable hunger for the $50,000 she thought was coming her way. She took the heavy fountain pen from my hand. She leaned over my kitchen island, her gold bracelets clinking against the granite. With a flourish, she signed her full legal name at the bottom of the page. I watched the black ink sink into the heavy paper. The trap did not just snap shut. It locked, bolted, and sealed itself forever. By signing that document, Chloe had just unknowingly confessed to the entire financial history of their theft. She had legally converted hundreds of thousands of dollars in stolen assets into a formally acknowledged binding debt. She had signed away her entire future because she was too arrogant to read the fine print and too greedy to question a sweet old woman. Chloe handed the pen back to me with a brilliant, victorious smile. "Thank you so much, Barbara. David is going to be so thrilled. This birthday party is going to be the event of the season." I pulled the signed document toward me, protecting it with my hand. "I am sure it will be a night everyone remembers for the rest of their lives," I said. She gathered her designer tote bag, gave me another fake kiss on the cheek, and marched out the front door. I stood in the kitchen listening to her luxury vehicle crunch down the gravel driveway and speed off down the road. I looked down at the paper in my hand. It was the most beautiful legal weapon I had ever created. Head and Chloe thought they were brilliant architects of a flawless crime. They thought they had successfully drained their parents dry, but they had just handed me the legal authority to seize everything they owned. I walked to my office, locked the signed document inside my fireproof safe, and picked up my phone to call the most ruthless estate litigator in the county. It was time to prepare the ambush. The ink on Chloe's signature was barely dry before I was pulling my car into the underground parking garage of the most intimidating legal building in our city. I did not need a standard family attorney who would try to mediate a peaceful resolution. I needed a shark. William Sterling was a senior estate litigator known throughout the financial district for dismantling corporate trusts, ruining fraudulent business partners, and destroying greedy heirs. I had worked across the table from him a decade ago during a highly contentious commercial bank merger, and I knew he possessed the exact lack of mercy this specific situation required. I walked into his corner office overlooking the downtown skyline and dropped my heavy leather briefcase directly onto his polished mahogany desk. William sat back in his chair, folding his hands together, his sharp gray eyes studying my face. He had known me for years as a composed, highly conservative banking executive. He could tell immediately that the woman standing in his office today had gone to war. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I opened the briefcase and began laying the documents out on his desk one by one, creating a physical timeline of my son's absolute betrayal. First, I set down the wire transfer receipts, showing the systematic draining of $400,000 from our primary retirement accounts. Second, I placed the approved loan origination file for the $250,000 home equity line of credit that had been secretly attached to our fully paid-off house. Third, I placed the enlarged high-resolution copy of the final signature page, pointing directly to the blue notary stamp bearing Chloe's legal name. William leaned forward. He picked up the notary page, his eyes scanning the forged signature and the fraudulent verification seal. He is a man who rarely shows surprise, but a low, impressed whistle escaped his lips. "Your daughter-in-law notarized a federal property loan that directly enriched her own household," he said, his voice dropping into a register of pure professional shock. "Barbara, this is not just civil theft. This is a severe federal crime. This is wire fraud, bank fraud, and official misconduct, all wrapped into one extremely stupid package." "I know," I replied smoothly, "but I brought you something even better." I reached into my briefcase one final time and pulled out the heavy stock paper that Chloe had eagerly signed in my kitchen less than an hour ago. I slid the debt acknowledgement and promissory note across the desk. William picked it up and read through the dense legal formatting I had drafted. As he reached the second paragraph, a slow, predatory smile spread across his face. He looked up at me, shaking his head in absolute disbelief. "She signed this?" he asked. "She actually signed a legally binding document acknowledging receipt of all the stolen funds and classifying the entire $650,000 sum as an active callable debt owed directly to you. She thought it was an internal tax compliance form to release another $50,000 for a kitchen remodel," I explained, taking a seat in the leather chair opposite his desk. "She was too greedy to read the fine print." William set the document down and folded his hands together again. He looked at the evidence spread across his desk, the complete, undeniable proof of a massive financial conspiracy perpetrated by my own family. "If we take this to the local police or the Federal Bureau of Investigation right now, they will absolutely arrest Chloe and David," he said, shifting into a purely tactical mindset. "Justin's commercial real estate firm will be raided by federal agents before the end of the week. But Barbara, you need to understand the financial danger of triggering a federal criminal investigation today." I listened carefully, respecting his expertise. "If we drop the criminal hammer right now," William explained, "the government will immediately freeze every single asset connected to Justin, Chloe, and David. They will lock down their personal checking accounts, their corporate holding accounts, and their properties under civil asset forfeiture laws. The money will be trapped in a federal evidence hold for years while the courts sort out the Ponzi scheme. You and Tom would be standing in line with dozens of other defrauded investors, hoping to get pennies on the dollar half a decade from now. You could lose your house to the bank before the federal government ever releases your stolen funds. The reality of his words settled over me. He was entirely correct. Justice was important, but survival was mandatory. I could not let Tom lose his home of 40 years just to see my son put in handcuffs a few weeks early. We needed to recover our equity before the federal government burned the entire operation to the ground. We need to strike civilly first, I said, leaning forward. We need to use this debt acknowledgement to secure their physical assets before the criminal asset freeze takes effect. William nodded in agreement. He turned to his computer and opened his firm's proprietary legal database. We need to see exactly what David and Chloe currently own that we can place a lien against to satisfy this newly acknowledged debt. Let us pull the current property records for their primary residence. He typed their suburban address into the search bar. The screen loaded, filling with dense rows of property tax history, mortgage originations, and municipal records. William stopped typing. He leaned closer to the monitor, his brow furrowing in deep concentration. The silence in the office stretched out heavy and thick with sudden tension. "Barbara," he said quietly, his eyes locked on the screen. "Did David mention anything to you about his primary mortgage?" "Nothing," I replied. "Chloe just spent 20 minutes sitting at my kitchen island complaining about how tight money was for their upcoming party and their luxury kitchen remodel." "Why? What are you seeing?" William turned his monitor around so I could view the screen. "They are not just tight on money," he said, pointing a gold pen at a specific line of red text flashing on the public record. "David has not paid the primary mortgage on that massive suburban mansion in 9 months. The bank filed a formal notice of default 60 days ago. The property is currently in active pre-foreclosure." I stared at the screen, my mind struggling to process the sheer scale of their financial ruin. They had stolen hundreds of thousands of dollars from my retirement accounts. They had drained $250,000 in equity from my home. And yet they had not used a single cent of that stolen money to secure their own roof. They had funneled every last dime into Justin's fraudulent commercial real estate scheme, hoping for massive returns, while allowing their own home to fall into total default. They were living in a $1 million mansion that they no longer had any right to occupy. "When is the bank auction?" I asked, my voice deadly calm. William scrolled down to the bottom of the legal notice. "The public trustee sale is already scheduled. The bank is auctioning the debt on the county courthouse steps." He checked the calendar on his desk. "The auction is set for exactly 10 days from today." 10 days. The calculation hit me with the force of a freight train. 10 days from today was a Thursday, David's extravagant catered 35th birthday party. The party Chloe was currently spending thousands of dollars on credit cards to plan was scheduled for that exact same weekend. They were throwing a massive pretentious country club dinner party in a house that was scheduled to be sold at a public foreclosure auction just 48 hours prior. They honestly believed Justin's fake real estate returns were going to miraculously drop into their accounts at the very last second, allowing them to pay off the defaulted mortgage right before the gavel fell. They were dancing on the edge of a cliff, completely blind to the fall. A plan began to form in my mind. It was a plan so aggressive, so financially violent, that it genuinely frightened me for a moment. But then I thought about Tom kneeling in the dirt, working his hands to the bone to provide for a son who was perfectly willing to let him be thrown out into the street. The fear vanished, replaced by an absolute, unshakable resolve. "William," I said, looking away from the monitor and meeting my lawyer's eyes, "we are not going to file a standard civil lawsuit. We are not going to place a slow-moving lien against a property that is already drowning in defaulted bank debt." "What exactly are you proposing?" he asked, leaning back and watching me carefully. "I am proposing that we attend that public auction," I said. I stood up and began pacing the length of his corner office, my 35 years of banking strategy taking complete control of the situation. "David does not know this, but Tom and I have a secondary portfolio of municipal bonds that we never link to our primary retirement portal. It is completely untouched. It holds roughly $150,000. Tomorrow morning, I am going to liquidate that entire portfolio. Furthermore, I spent 3 decades making millions of dollars for commercial lenders in this city. I know every senior underwriter and every private equity director within a 50-mile radius. I am going to make a few quiet phone calls and secure a high-interest short-term commercial hard money loan to cover the difference. William's eyes widened as the sheer magnitude of my strategy dawned on him. You want to buy the defaulted debt. You want to buy your son's house right out from under him at the courthouse steps. I do not just want to buy it, I corrected him. I want you to establish a blind limited liability company this afternoon. I want the purchasing entity completely obscured behind layers of corporate privacy laws. When I win that auction, I do not want my name anywhere on the public transfer documents. I want to own that sprawling, pretentious mansion, and I do not want David or Chloe to have absolutely any idea who their new landlord is. William let out a deep, genuine laugh. It was a sound of pure professional admiration. Barbara, if you successfully outbid the market and purchase the deed at the trustee sale, you become the immediate legal owner of the property. David and Chloe will lose all ownership rights instantly. They will legally become nothing more than unauthorized squatters residing in your house. Exactly, I said, stopping in front of his desk. And once the blind corporation officially owns the property, I want you to draft a formal, legally binding 30-day notice of eviction. I want the documents printed on the heaviest legal stock you have in this office. I want copies of the foreclosure sale, the new deed transfer, and the eviction mandate perfectly organized into 30 separate envelopes. William picked up his pen, making rapid notes on his legal pad, completely engaged in the tactical execution of the ambush. And how exactly do you plan on serving these eviction documents to the unauthorized occupants? I looked out the window at the sprawling city below, thinking about the arrogant woman who had sat in my kitchen and insulted the man I loved. I thought about the 30 wealthy, pretentious guests she had invited to celebrate an empire built entirely on stolen money and forged signatures. I am going to deliver them myself, I said, my voice dropping to a quiet, dangerous whisper. I am going to attend my son's birthday dinner. I am going to sit at that massive mahogany table, eat the food she paid for with my stolen equity, and I am going to serve the eviction notices right alongside the dessert course. William stopped writing. He looked up at me, a profound respect settling over his features. He understood perfectly that this was no longer just a financial recovery operation. This was an execution. I will have the blind corporation registered by tomorrow morning, he said, his tone entirely serious. I will monitor the auction registration and ensure we have the certified cashier checks prepared for the courthouse steps. But Barbara, you must understand, if we execute this strategy, there is no going back. You are going to permanently destroy your son's life in front of everyone he knows. Mod his choices, William, I replied, picking up my leather briefcase. He chose his pride over his family. He chose to steal his father's dignity to buy his wife's affection. I am not destroying his life. I am simply enforcing the consequences he purchased. I walked out of the law firm and took the elevator down to the underground parking garage. My mind was entirely clear. The initial shock of the betrayal was completely gone, burned away by the necessary heat of the impending battle. I had exactly 10 days to liquidate my hidden bonds, leverage my banking reputation, to secure the hard money loan, and position myself to strike. 10 days to prepare for a public auction that would decide the fate of my family's remaining wealth. I started my car and drove out into the busy city streets, ready to dismantle a fraudulent empire from the ground up. The air inside the county courthouse always smells like floor wax and desperation. I know that smell intimately. During my 35 years in the banking industry, I had attended dozens of public trustee sales to represent the financial interests of my branch. Foreclosure auctions are not glamorous events. They are clinical, bureaucratic executions of the American dream. People lose their homes, their sanctuaries, and their futures, while a bored county official reads property descriptions from a clipboard at a blistering pace. It is a brutal environment. I never expected to be sitting on one of these hard wooden benches waiting for my own son's address to be called. William Sterling sat beside me in the very back row of the gallery. He wore a charcoal suit that projected absolute authority, holding a leather folio containing the certified cashier checks we had prepared the day before. We had arrived 30 minutes early to secure our position in the shadows near the heavy oak doors. I wore a wide-brimmed hat and a dark trench coat, keeping my head tilted downward. I did not want to be recognized. We were registered under a newly formed, completely opaque entity named Oak Grove Holdings Limited Liability Company. On paper, I did not exist. I was merely a phantom holding a massive sum of liquid capital. The heavy wooden doors swung open, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop. Justin Miller walked into the gallery. He moved with the swagger of a man who firmly believed he was the smartest predator in the ocean. He wore a sharp, tailored suit without a tie, an expensive watch catching the fluorescent lights, and a smug, satisfied smirk. He carried a sleek folder, confidently taking a seat in the second row, right near the auctioneer podium. He wanted to be seen. He wanted to project dominance over the local real estate scavengers who populated these daily sales. I stared at the back of his perfectly styled head. My pulse remained completely steady. Justin was sitting there holding cashier checks funded directly by the retirement accounts he and his sister had drained from my husband. He was planning to use our stolen money to buy his sister's defaulted mortgage for pennies on the dollar. It was a disgustingly brilliant scheme. He would clear the bank debt, secure the deed under his own corporate umbrella, and allow Chloe and David to continue living in their massive suburban mansion without ever paying another dime to a traditional lender. He thought he had orchestrated the perfect financial loop. The county trustee, a tired-looking woman in a beige cardigan, stepped up to the wooden podium. She began reading the legal disclaimers in a monotone voice, rattling off statutes and bidding rules that everyone in the room already knew by heart. The gallery was sparse today. A few professional house flippers sat in the middle rows, scrolling through their phones and waiting for specific distressed properties to cross the block. Then the trustee cleared her throat and called out the parcel number. She read the physical address of the sprawling, pretentious mansion my son called home. I felt William shift slightly beside me. He opened his leather folio, his pen poised over his bidding paddle. The starting bid requested by the bank to clear the defaulted debt was staggeringly low compared to the actual market value of the property. The lending institution simply wanted to wipe the bad loan off their books and recover their initial investment. The trustee announced the opening price. Justin immediately raised his numbered paddle high into the air. He did not even look around. He wanted to establish instant dominance, signaling to the room that he had the capital to crush any casual investors. A man in a plaid shirt, sitting 2 rows ahead of us, raised his paddle, offering a modest increase. Justin scoffed loudly, a sound of pure arrogance, and raised his paddle again, bumping the bid up by $20,000. He was trying to scare the room into submission. The man in the plaid shirt shook his head, lowered his paddle, and went back to looking at his phone. The trustee looked out over the quiet gallery. She called out Justin's bid, asking if there were any other takers. She raised her gavel, preparing to strike the wooden block and finalize the sale. Justin actually leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms behind his head. I nodded to my attorney. William calmly raised his paddle. He did not shout. He simply stated a number that was exactly $50,000 higher than Justin's current bid. The sound of William's voice cut through the stagnant air of the courthouse. Justin whipped his head around, his smug expression instantly vanishing. He scanned the back rows, his eyes narrowing as he tried to identify the man in the charcoal suit who had just ruined his easy victory. He did not recognize William, and because I was angled away in the shadows, he did not see me at all. Justin gritted his teeth, turning back to the front. He raised his paddle again, aggressively shouting out a counteroffer, $10,000 higher. He was trying to reassert control. He was trying to prove that his pockets were infinitely deep. He did not understand that he was fighting a war of attrition against the very woman whose money he was currently spending. I knew exactly how much liquidity Justin possessed because I knew exactly how much he had stolen from me. I had calculated his maximum threshold down to the final dollar. My hard money loan, backed by 35 years of immaculate banking credit, vastly exceeded anything he could pull from his fraudulent commercial accounts. William did not even wait for the trustee to acknowledge Justin's bid. He raised his paddle and immediately countered, adding another $40,000 to the price. The speed of William's response was a calculated psychological tactic. It sent a clear, devastating message to the other bidder. We will not stop. We have unlimited capital. You cannot win. The tension in the gallery spiked. The professional flippers put their phones down and turned around in their seats, watching the heavy-hitting corporate battle unfolding before them. This was no longer a routine foreclosure sale. This was a bloodbath. Justin's posture completely deteriorated. He dropped his arms from behind his head. He leaned forward, gripping the wooden back of the pew in front of him. I could see the rigid tension in his shoulders. He was doing mental math, realizing that the profit margin on his sister's house was rapidly evaporating. But he was trapped by his own arrogance. If he lost this auction, the house would fall to a third-party investor. Chloe and David would be evicted by a stranger, and his status as the brilliant financial savior of the family would be completely destroyed. He raised his paddle again, his voice cracking slightly as he called out a number that I knew pushed him right to the absolute limit of his available stolen funds. It was a desperate final swing. I leaned close to William. "Break him," I whispered. William raised his paddle for the final time. He delivered a bid that shattered Justin's ceiling by a full $100,000. It was a number that commanded absolute authority. It was a bid that definitively proved whoever was sitting in the back row possessed resources far beyond the realm of amateur real estate scams. Justin completely deflated. His shoulders slumped. He stared at the floor, his breathing visibly shallow. He could not raise his paddle again. I was financially tapped out. The stolen money he relied on had finally run dry, overpowered by a tidal wave of legitimate strategic capital. The trustee called the final number once. She called it twice. She looked directly at Justin, offering him one last chance to save his sister's mansion. Justin slowly shook his head, a look of profound, sickening defeat washing over his features. The heavy wooden gavel came down with a sharp, echoing crack. "Sold," the trustee announced, pointing her pen toward the back row. "Sold to Oak Grove Holdings Limited Liability Company." I let out a long, slow breath. The physical relief that washed through my body was indescribable. I leaned my head back against the hard wooden bench and closed my eyes for just a fraction of a second. We had done it. We had successfully executed one of the most aggressive financial maneuvers of my entire life. Justin stood up abruptly, grabbing his sleek folder. He practically ran down the center aisle, desperate to escape the humiliation of his public defeat. He stormed out through the heavy oak doors, completely unaware that he had just been financially annihilated by the grandmother he thought he had successfully robbed. William and I waited until the gallery cleared before approaching the clerk desk to finalize the paperwork. We handed over the certified cashier checks, covering the massive purchase price entirely in cleared funds. I watched as the county clerk stamped the official transfer documents. The sheer gravity of the moment settled over me as I looked at the freshly inked deed. I was now the absolute, uncontested legal owner of my son's sprawling suburban mansion. The bank no longer held the mortgage. David no longer held the title. The property belonged entirely to my blind corporation. Which meant that at this exact moment, as Chloe was undoubtedly browsing online for expensive floral arrangements and luxury caterers for the upcoming birthday dinner, she was sitting in a house she had absolutely no legal right to occupy. David and Chloe were no longer homeowners. They were not even renters. They were officially unauthorized squatters residing on my private property. William packed the heavily stamped documents into his leather folio. We walked out of the courthouse together, stepping into the bright, warm afternoon sun. The air felt remarkably clean. We stopped on the wide concrete steps overlooking the busy downtown street. "This was a masterclass in tactical acquisition," Barbara Williams said, his voice filled with deep professional respect. "The property is legally secured. The title is clear. The deed is officially recorded under the blind entity. They have absolutely no idea what is coming." I looked out at the traffic flowing past the courthouse, my mind already moving forward to the final phase of the operation. The purchase was merely the foundation. The true purpose of this entire endeavor was the delivery. "William," I said, turning to face my attorney, "I need you to go back to your office right now and draft a formal, legally binding 30-day notice of eviction to vacate the premises. I want the language to be absolutely merciless. I want it to clearly state that the occupants have no legal standing, no lease agreement, and no right to remain on the property." "Consider it done," he replied smoothly. "How do you want to handle the service of the documents? Normally, we hire a private process server or have the county sheriff tape the notice to their front door." I shook my head. A piece of paper taped to a door is too easily ignored. A process server is too impersonal. When people steal your life savings and forge federal documents to drain the equity from your sanctuary, you do not outsource the consequences. You deliver them by hand. I want you to make 30 distinct copies of the new property deed, the foreclosure auction receipt, and the eviction mandate, I instructed him. I want them placed into 30 thick, unmarked envelopes. William raised an eyebrow, quickly calculating the social math of my request. 30 envelopes. You are going to serve the entire guest list. I smiled, feeling a profound sense of dangerous anticipation. David's birthday dinner is scheduled for next Thursday evening. Chloe has invited the wealthiest, most arrogant people in her social circle to sit in that dining room and admire an empire she built by robbing an old man. I am going to let them enjoy their expensive wine and their catered appetizers. I am going to wait until she stands up to make a toast to her own brilliant success. And then, William, I am going to serve her the eviction notice under her own dessert plate." William Sterling actually chuckled a low, dark sound of pure litigation joy. He adjusted his briefcase and nodded firmly. "I will have the 30 envelopes prepared and sealed by tomorrow morning." We parted ways on the courthouse steps. I walked to my car feeling lighter than I had in nearly a month. The defensive portion of this war was officially over. My assets were secured, and the trap was perfectly set. All that remained was to let Chloe and David finish setting their own stage, completely blind to the fact that the curtain was about to drop on their entire existence. I had the deed. I had the evidence. Now I just needed to pick out a nice dress for a birthday party. 48 hours before the birthday dinner was scheduled to begin, I sat at my kitchen island with a cup of black coffee and my tablet. The house was perfectly quiet. The deed to my son's massive suburban mansion was locked safely inside my fireproof floor safe. The legal foundation of my daughter-in-law's fake empire had been entirely demolished. Yet looking at her public social media profiles, you would have thought she was royalty preparing for a coronation. Chloe was posting relentlessly. Every hour brought a new digital update broadcasting her extravagant wealth to her hundreds of country club acquaintances. I scrolled through videos of delivery trucks pulling into the driveway of the house I now legally owned. I watched her point her phone camera at massive arrangements of imported white orchids, boasting about flying them in specifically for the centerpieces. She posted a photo of the custom menu the private caterers were preparing, highlighting the expensive cuts of beef and the vintage champagne she had ordered by the case. She was documenting a financial illusion in real time. I knew exactly how she was funding this spectacular display of arrogance. Because I had trapped her into signing that legally binding debt acknowledgement, I had effectively frozen her ability to access any remaining liquid capital from Justin's fraudulent accounts. She was currently charging every single flower, every bottle of wine, and every hour of catering labor to high-interest credit cards. She was completely maxing out her credit limits under the absolute delusional certainty that her brother was going to hand her a massive commercial dividend check the following week to clear the balances. She had absolutely no idea that her brother had been financially annihilated on the county courthouse steps the day before. She did not know that Justin was currently scrambling to hide his remaining assets because his Ponzi scheme was entirely bankrupt. She was blissfully decorating a house she no longer owned, preparing to host a party with money she did not have to impress people who did not actually care about her. I turned off the tablet screen and finished my coffee. It was time to initiate the final bureaucratic mechanism of my strategy. Securing my stolen equity and seizing their property was the civil remedy. But civil remedies do not put financial predators in prison. I put on a tailored gray suit, gathered a meticulously organized heavy binder from my desk, and drove downtown to the regional field office of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. A federal building is designed to be intimidating. There is no warm lighting or comfortable leather seating. There are metal detectors, armed security guards, and long corridors of cold gray tile. I navigated the security checkpoint with the calm precision of a woman who had spent decades managing corporate banking compliance. I approached the front desk and stated that I had physical, documented evidence of a multi-million-dollar commercial wire fraud operation and an active real estate Ponzi scheme. Within 20 minutes, I was sitting in a stark, windowless interview room across a metal table from a senior financial crimes agent. He introduced himself as Agent Davis. He had tired eyes and a demeanor that suggested he spent his days listening to people tell complicated lies. He opened a standard notepad and asked me to explain the situation. I did not give him a dramatic emotional story about a betrayed mother and a broken family. Federal agents do not care about hurt feelings. They care about paper trails, statutory violations, and actionable evidence. I opened my binder and began sliding the documents across the metal table one by one. I started with the glossy commercial prospectuses I had acquired directly from Justin's office. I explained that Apex Premier Holdings was soliciting private investments under the guise of luxury commercial development. I then provided the bank routing receipts, proving that the holding company was actively commingling unverified outside capital to pay off the personal delinquent residential mortgages of the chief executive's family members. Agent Davis stopped taking notes. He looked at the routing numbers, his professional skepticism immediately replaced by sharp, focused attention. He recognized the exact architecture of a collapsing Ponzi scheme. Then I delivered the killing blow. I slid the final stack of papers across the table. I presented the origination file for the $250,000 home equity line of credit. I pointed directly to the blue notary stamp at the bottom of the final page. I provided a certified copy of Chloe's state notary commission record. I explained clearly and precisely that the notary public who had verified the signatures on a federally backed $250,000 loan was the direct legal spouse of the man receiving the money. I explained that she had intentionally falsified a government credential to bypass bank underwriting protocols and extract equity from a property she did not own. Agent Davis stared at the blue stamp for a very long time. In the world of federal financial prosecution, finding a clean, undisputed case of notary fraud attached to interstate wire transfers is incredibly rare. Criminals are usually smart enough to obscure their tracks. Chloe had been too arrogant and too lazy to hire an outside proxy. She had stamped her own federal indictment with her own name. Agent Davis looked up at me. The tired look was completely gone from his eyes. He gathered the documents, placed them securely into a federal evidence file, and told me that a formal investigation would be opened immediately. He explained that due to the commingling of funds and the active fraud across state banking lines, they would be moving very quickly to secure the remaining commercial ledgers. I stood up, shook his hand, and walked out of the federal building into the bustling city streets. The machine was now fully awake. I knew exactly how the Department of Justice operated. They would spend the next 48 hours quietly pulling Justin's commercial bank records. They would verify the fraudulent notary stamp with the state licensing board. And then, without any warning, they would arrive at his flashy rented office with a stack of federal warrants and a team of forensic accountants. Justin's fake empire was living on borrowed hours. I drove home and spent the next 2 days in the quiet sanctuary of my own house. I did not check social media again. I did not look at my phone. I simply spent time with Tom, enjoying the absolute peace of knowing our future was entirely secure. Saturday evening arrived with a cool, gentle breeze. It was the night of David's 35th birthday dinner. I walked into our master bedroom and found Tom standing in front of the full-length mirror. He was wearing his best dark suit. It was a well-made suit, but it was several years old, lacking the modern tailored cut that David and his wealthy friends preferred. Tom was struggling with his silk necktie. His large, rough hands, so perfectly capable of grafting delicate rose bushes and building sturdy wooden trellises, were fumbling awkwardly with the thin fabric. I walked up behind him and gently placed my hands over his. I guided the silk ribbon through the loop, pulled it snug against his collar, and smoothed the lapels of his jacket. He looked at our reflection in the mirror. His eyes were heavy with a profound, quiet sorrow. "Do we really have to go to this, Barbara?" he asked softly. My heart ached for him. For the past 3 weeks, I had managed the tactical execution of our financial recovery. I had dealt with the lawyers, the federal agents, and the banking executives. But Tom had been left to process the devastating emotional reality that his only child had plotted to leave him destitute. He was a man who had sacrificed his own comfort for decades to ensure his son had every advantage in life. The betrayal had cut him down to the bone. "They do not want us there," Tom continued, looking down at his calloused hands. "Chloe makes it painfully obvious every time we walk into that house. I just feel like we failed him somewhere. I feel like I did not teach him how to be a good man." I turned him around to face me. I reached up and rested my palms against his chest, feeling the steady, reliable rhythm of his heart. "You did not fail him, Tom," I said, making sure my voice carried absolute, unwavering certainty. "You taught him the value of hard work. You showed him what it means to be an honest, dedicated provider. You gave him an immaculate foundation. We are not responsible for the fact that he decided to trade his integrity for a counterfeit lifestyle. He is a grown man. He made his choices completely on his own." Tom sighed a heavy, weary sound. He nodded slowly, but the sadness did not leave his eyes. "I just do not know if I can sit at that table tonight and pretend to celebrate a life he built by stealing from us. I do not know if I have the strength to smile at those people." I slid my hand down his arm and intertwined my fingers with his. The skin on his palm was rough like sandpaper, the physical evidence of a lifetime of honest labor. It was the most beautiful texture in the world to me. I looked directly into his eyes, letting him see the absolute ironclad resolve burning inside me. "You do not have to pretend to celebrate anything," I told him, my voice dropping into a quiet, fierce whisper. "You do not have to smile at a single person in that room. You just have to walk through those doors with your head held high and watch me work." I picked up my elegant evening purse from the bed. Tucked safely inside the silk lining was a thick, heavy folder containing 30 copies of a perfectly drafted, mercilessly written legal eviction mandate. "Tonight we do not grieve," I said, gripping his hand tightly. "Tonight we collect." Tom looked at the fierce determination in my face. The sorrow in his eyes slowly gave way to a quiet, profound trust. He had spent his entire life protecting me, and he knew that tonight I was going to burn down a corrupt empire to protect him. He straightened his shoulders, took a deep breath, and offered me his arm. We walked out to our modest sedan and drove toward the wealthy suburban district on the other side of town. The streets grew wider and more heavily manicured the closer we got to the neighborhood. The streetlights illuminated massive brick facades and sprawling green lawns. We turned onto David Street, and the reality of Chloe's extravagant planning came into full view. The driveway was entirely blocked by a professional valet service. A line of luxury sedans and imported sports cars stretched down the block. Soft, elegant classical music drifted out from the open windows of the brightly lit mansion. Tom parked our car far down the street, away from the aggressive display of wealth. We walked together up the long, curving concrete driveway. I could see the caterers moving through the grand foyer carrying silver trays of expensive champagne. I could hear the loud, pretentious laughter of Chloe's country club friends echoing through the open double doors. They were drinking wine purchased with our stolen equity. They were standing on hardwood floors that now legally belonged to my blind corporation. They were laughing and celebrating in a house that was about to become the epicenter of a massive federal fraud investigation. I touched the clasp of my purse one final time, feeling the solid weight of the documents inside. The preparation was completely finished. The traps were set. The federal machine was moving. I took a deep breath of the cool evening air, adjusted my jacket, and walked through the heavy double doors into the grand foyer, stepping directly into the center of my son's fraudulent life, ready to tear it all down to the ground. The grand dining room was suffocatingly warm, filled with the overwhelming scent of roasted tenderloin, heavy, expensive perfumes, and the sharp tang of artificial wealth. 30 guests sat around the massive mahogany table, their faces glowing in the soft light of 3 enormous crystal chandeliers. These were the elite members of the local country club, a collection of local politicians, minor real estate developers, and socialites who spent their days comparing luxury cars and vacation homes. They laughed too loudly at unfunny jokes. They held their wine glasses by the stem, inspecting the vintage before taking calculated sips. I sat at the very end of the table, nearest to the swinging kitchen door, watching this elaborate theater of arrogance unfold. Tom sat quietly beside me. He wore the dark suit I had helped him into just an hour ago. He had barely touched his food. His rough, soil-stained hands rested neatly on his lap. He looked like a king forced to sit among jesters. At the head of the table, my daughter-in-law was holding court. Chloe was in her element, completely intoxicated by her own perceived success. She dominated the conversation loudly, complaining to a local judge about the delays in importing the Italian marble for her upcoming kitchen remodel. David sat next to her, knocking back his 3rd glass of whiskey. My son looked hollowed out, a man carrying the invisible crushing weight of a collapsing criminal enterprise, yet entirely too cowardly to stop his wife from spending money they no longer possessed. Sitting just 3 seats down from Chloe was her brother Justin. He looked incredibly smug, swirling his wine and leaning back in his chair with the relaxed posture of a man who thought he had outsmarted the entire financial system. He had absolutely no idea that less than 48 hours ago, I had financially gutted him on the steps of the county courthouse. The caterers began clearing the main course plates to prepare for dessert. The string quartet in the foyer shifted to a bright, lively classical piece. Chloe stood up. She picked up a silver spoon and tapped it sharply against her crystal wine glass. The sharp ringing sound commanded the attention of the entire room. The guests stopped talking and turned their expectant faces toward the head of the table. Chloe raised her glass high into the air. She beamed at David, but her eyes scanned the room to ensure everyone was properly admiring her. "I want to propose a toast to my wonderful husband on his 35th birthday," she announced, her voice carrying an unmistakable tone of profound condescension. When I first met David, he was just a simple guy from a very humble, very dirty blue-collar background. Nobody ever thought he would amount to much. But look at us now. I took him out of the dirt, I polished him up, and together we built this magnificent, beautiful life. We are the definition of success." The guests murmured their polite agreements, raising their glasses in a synchronized display of shallow affection. It was at that exact moment that a young waiter stepped behind Tom to clear his dinner plate. My husband, always courteous, always possessing the instinct to help working people, reached across the table to hand the waiter an empty bread dish. It was a completely harmless, polite movement. But as Tom pulled his arm back, the cuff of his jacket caught the heavy base of a crystal goblet filled with red wine. The glass tipped over. It hit the edge of a silver serving tray and shattered with a sharp, violent crack. A wave of dark red wine flooded across the pristine white linen tablecloth. It dripped rapidly off the edge of the mahogany table and splashed onto the imported hardwood floor. The string quartet abruptly stopped playing. The lively chatter in the dining room died instantly. 30 heads turned to look at the far end of the table. Tom immediately pushed his chair back, his face flushed with deep, genuine embarrassment. He grabbed his white cloth napkin and dropped to his knees, frantically trying to soak up the spilled wine from the wood floor. He apologized quietly and sincerely to the young waiter, assuring the boy that it was entirely his own fault. It was a simple accident, a spilled drink. It meant absolutely nothing. But Chloe slammed her wine glass down onto the table. The sound cracked like a whip. She marched past her wealthy friends, her designer heels striking the floor with aggressive, hateful force. She stopped right behind my husband, looming over him while he was still on his knees trying to clean her floor. "Look what you did," she hissed, her voice vibrating with absolute venom. Tom looked up, the cloth napkin stained red in his hands. "I am so sorry, Chloe. I did not see the glass. I will gladly pay to replace the crystal, and I can get this stain out of the floor." "You cannot clean this up," she shouted, completely abandoning her refined hostess persona. "That is a custom-ordered linen cloth. Those glasses are imported. You always ruin everything. You do not belong in a house like this. You belong out in the dirt. You are nothing but a clumsy old gardener, and you are an absolute embarrassment to me and to your son." The guests froze. Nobody dared to breathe. David remained glued to his chair at the head of the table. He stared at his empty whiskey glass, choosing his own comfort over the dignity of the man who had raised him. He let his wife treat his father like garbage. I felt a cold, magnificent clarity wash over my entire body. I did not feel anger anymore. Anger is an emotion reserved for equals. I felt only the absolute surgical precision of an executioner stepping up to the block. I pushed my chair back. I stood up slowly, deliberately, letting the wooden legs scrape loudly against the floor. I adjusted the lapels of my gray suit. I stepped forward and placed myself directly between my kneeling husband and the vicious woman screaming at him. "Do not ever speak to my husband that way again," I said. My voice was not loud. It did not need to be loud. It carried the chilling, absolute authority of a woman who held the financial fate of everyone in that room in the palm of her hand. Chloe let out a harsh, barking laugh, crossing her arms over her chest. "Or what, Barbara? You are going to lecture me in my own dining room. I am sick and tired of pretending to tolerate you two. You come into my beautiful home, you break my expensive things, and you humiliate me in front of my guests. I am completely done with you. Take your gardener husband and get out of my house, right now." I did not move a single inch. I looked at the 30 elite guests staring at us. I looked at Justin, who was grinning from his seat, enjoying the show. I looked at my cowardly son. Then I looked directly into Chloe's eyes. "It is actually my house, Chloe," I said. Chloe scoffed, tossing her perfectly styled hair. "You are completely delusional." I took one step forward, closing the distance between us. "I am not delusional, and this is not your house. In fact, if you ask your lovely guests to lift their dessert plates, they will find some highly educational reading material. Your official 30-day eviction notice to vacate the premises is currently sitting under your dessert plate, Chloe, and a certified copy of the legal deed transfer is sitting under everyone else's." The entire dining room inhaled sharply. For 3 agonizing seconds, nobody moved. Then a prominent local judge sitting near the center of the table slowly reached out and lifted his gold-rimmed dessert plate. Underneath it was a thick, heavy envelope. He opened it. He pulled out the heavy stock legal paper. A woman sitting next to him did the same. Within moments, the absolute silence of the dining room was broken by the frantic, chaotic rustling of 30 heavy paper envelopes being torn open. "What is this?" someone whispered loudly. "This is a recorded deed of trust," another guest muttered in shock. "The property belongs to a holding corporation." Chloe snatched an envelope from the empty place setting next to her. She ripped it open and pulled out the legal mandate. Her eyes darted wildly across the bold black text. The color completely drained from her face, leaving her looking sickly and pale. Her hands began to shake so violently the paper rattled. "David," she shrieked, her voice cracking in pure panic. "David, what is this? Tell them this is a lie. Tell them we own this house." David finally stood up. His legs looked unsteady. He gripped the edge of the mahogany table, looking at the legal document in front of him. He looked at me, his eyes wide with a sudden devastating realization. "Mom," he choked out, his voice barely a whisper. "Mom, what is this?" I turned my back on Chloe and addressed the entire dining room. I projected my voice so every single wealthy, arrogant person sitting at that table could hear the precise details of their host's criminal enterprise. "This is a foreclosure transfer," I announced clearly. "My son and his wife have not paid the mortgage on this sprawling mansion in 9 months. The bank pushed this property into active foreclosure. Yesterday morning on the steps of the county courthouse, I purchased the defaulted debt through a blind corporate entity. I am the absolute legal owner of this property. David and Chloe do not own the ground they are standing on. They are officially unauthorized squatters, and they have exactly 30 days to pack their luxury clothes and vacate my premises." A collective gasp rippled through the guests. Several people dropped their documents onto the table as if the paper itself were contaminated. But I was not finished. I turned my attention back to David, raising my voice to carry over the rising murmurs of the panicked guests. "You thought I would not notice, David. You thought you could use a 5-year-old emergency power of attorney to bypass federal banking security. You systematically drained $400,000 in cash from the retirement accounts your father broke his back to build. And when that stolen cash was not enough to fund your wife's country club memberships, you forged a $250,000 home equity line of credit against our fully paid-off home." The judge, sitting at the middle of the table, stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly. Forged a loan, he asked, his legal instincts immediately recognizing the severity of the situation. "Yes," I said, looking directly at the judge. "He forged the loan documents, and his wife Chloe illegally acted as the notary public, using her own state commission stamp to verify a fraudulent federal property loan that directly enriched her own household." Chloe let out a strangled, breathless sound. She dropped the eviction notice onto the spilled wine on the floor. I looked around the room at the 30 elite guests. They were staring at Chloe and David with absolute, undisguised horror. "Every single bite of food you are eating tonight," I told the crowd, "every drop of that imported wine you are drinking, the string quartet playing in the hallway, the exotic flowers sitting on this table, all of it was paid for with money stolen from an old man who spent 40 years pulling weeds and hauling dirt. You are celebrating a mirage funded by federal wire fraud." Guests began standing up immediately. Men reached for their suit jackets. Women grabbed their designer purses. Nobody in that room wanted to be associated with a federal banking crime. The social elite run from financial scandals faster than they run from a burning building. Chloe was hyperventilating. Her perfect posture had completely collapsed. She looked wildly around the room as her wealthy friends began rushing toward the grand foyer, desperate to escape the toxic fallout. "Justin," she screamed, turning toward her brother, who was frozen in his chair near the head of the table. "Justin, do something. Call your lawyers. Use the commercial funds. Tell them you will buy the house back. Fix this right now." Justin slowly stood up. The arrogant smirk he had worn all evening was completely gone. He looked like a man who had just stepped onto a landmine and heard the click. He opened his mouth to speak, to try and assert some kind of fraudulent authority over the collapsing situation. But before Justin could utter a single word, the heavy silence of the dining room was shattered by a sharp, aggressive sound. Justin's cell phone began ringing frantically inside his suit pocket. The sharp, aggressive electronic trill of a cellular phone cutting through the dead silence of a dining room is a sound I will never forget. It was jarring, violent, and entirely out of place in the middle of the opulent catastrophe I had just orchestrated. The ringing was coming from the breast pocket of Justin Miller's tailored suit. Everyone in the room turned their heads to look at him. A few seconds prior, Justin had been standing tall, preparing to unleash his arrogant fury, ready to verbally attack me for daring to challenge his sister in her own home. He had been fully prepared to play the role of the wealthy, protective brother who could fix any financial mess with a wave of his hand and a stroke of his pen. But the relentless ringing of his phone shattered his concentration. He reached into his pocket with a look of profound annoyance, intending to silence the device so he could return to intimidating me. He pulled the phone out and glanced at the bright screen. I watched the exact moment his annoyance morphed into sheer, unadulterated terror. The color drained from his face so rapidly that his skin took on a sickening ashen hue. His arrogant posture collapsed in on itself. He stared at the caller identification as if he were holding a live explosive. He did not silence the call. He answered it. He brought the phone to his ear with a trembling hand, his eyes wide and completely unfocused. I did not say a word. He just listened. I knew exactly who was on the other end of that line. It was his office manager calling from the sleek glass-paneled commercial building on the other side of the county. I knew what she was screaming into his ear because I had supplied the federal government with the precise documentation required to trigger the event. I watched Justin's jaw drop open. His breathing became incredibly shallow, turning into rapid, panicked gasps. Through the dead silence of the dining room, the frantic, muffled voice of the woman on the other end of the line was barely audible, but her tone was unmistakable. She was weeping. She was terrified. She was telling her boss that their building was currently swarming with federal agents. Justin stumbled backward, his expensive leather shoes catching on the edge of the plush dining room rug. He bumped into the wall, completely ignoring the shocked stares of the wealthy guests surrounding him. He whispered a single jagged question into the receiver. He asked what the agents were taking. He listened for another 3 seconds. The answer must have been devastating. They were taking everything. The Federal Bureau of Investigation was currently seizing the hard drives, boxing up the physical client ledgers, confiscating the glossy, fraudulent prospectuses, and locking down every single commercial bank account attached to Apex Premier Holdings Limited Liability Company. The federal machine had descended upon his Ponzi scheme with absolute unforgiving force. Justin slowly lowered the phone from his ear. The call was still connected, the tiny voice still crying out from the speaker, but he was no longer listening. He looked across the long mahogany table directly at me. For one fleeting second, our eyes locked. He saw the cold, immaculate stillness in my posture. He saw the absolute absence of mercy in my expression. The mathematical reality of his destruction finally processed in his arrogant mind. He realized that the sweet, confused old grandmother he had bragged to just days ago was actually the architect of his federal annihilation. He realized I had not just bought his sister's foreclosed house. I had burned his entire criminal empire to the ground. Survival instinct is a brutal, primal thing. It strips away all pretenses of loyalty, family, and courage. Justin did not try to help his sister. He did not step forward to defend her honor or offer a brilliant legal strategy to save her from the eviction notice currently soaking in spilled red wine on the floor. He dropped his phone onto the hardwood floor, letting the screen shatter against the planks. He turned around and bolted. He lunged toward the heavy swinging doors that led to the catering kitchen. He hit the wood with his shoulder, crashing through the threshold with the chaotic desperation of a cornered animal. We could hear the violent commotion bleeding out from the kitchen. We heard the screams of the hired catering staff as Justin plowed through them. We heard the shattering of porcelain plates, the clatter of silver serving trays hitting the tile, and the heavy slam of the back door being thrown open as he desperately sprinted toward the rear patio. He was trying to escape into the dark expanse of the massive suburban backyard, hoping to vanish into the neighborhood before the federal authorities could locate him. He did not make it past the edge of the stone patio. Suddenly, the massive floor-to-ceiling windows at the back of the dining room were illuminated by a blinding, chaotic explosion of red and blue strobe lights. The harsh, aggressive glare cut through the elegant dimness of the evening, throwing wild, spinning shadows across the crystal chandeliers and the terrified faces of the dinner guests. My attorney, William Sterling, had been meticulously thorough. He had known that the federal raid on the commercial office would immediately trigger a flight response from the primary suspect. William had preemptively contacted the local county sheriff's department. He had provided them with the documented evidence of Chloe's forged notary stamp and warned them that the chief executive of the collapsing Ponzi scheme would be attending a dinner party at this exact residential address. The local authorities had not parked in the driveway. They had quietly positioned their tactical vehicles in the alleyway behind the property, waiting in the darkness for the federal raid to flush the target out into the open. Through the large glass windows, the entire dining room watched the brutal conclusion of Justin's escape attempt. 4 uniformed police officers stepped out of the shadows of the manicured garden, their heavy tactical flashlights cutting through the night and pinning Justin against the brick facade of the mansion. He threw his hands up in the air, surrendering immediately. 2 officers moved in, grabbing his arms, forcing him to turn around and pressing his face against the cold brick wall. Even through the thick, insulated glass of the dining room windows, we could hear the sharp metallic ratcheting sound of the heavy steel handcuffs closing tightly around his wrists. We watched as the officers patted down his custom-tailored suit, stripped him of his expensive watch, and marched him aggressively across the lawn toward the back of a waiting police cruiser. The visual impact of the arrest was absolutely catastrophic for the atmosphere in the dining room. The 30 elite, pretentious guests, who had spent the entire evening bragging about their stock portfolios, their luxury cars, and their exclusive country club memberships, were suddenly paralyzed by the terrifying reality of federal law enforcement. Wealthy socialites have an intense, almost instinctual allergy to criminal investigations. The absolute last thing any of them wanted was to be photographed, questioned, or subpoenaed simply because they attended a dinner party funded by stolen retirement money. The tipping point arrived in a massive synchronized wave of panic. The prominent local judge sitting near the center of the table was the first to move. He threw his cloth napkin onto his plate, grabbed his wife by the arm, and practically sprinted toward the grand foyer. That single movement shattered the paralysis of the room. The dinner party instantly devolved into a stampede of terrified millionaires. Chairs were knocked over and left lying on the hardwood floor. Women abandoned their expensive cashmere wraps on the backs of their seats. Men shoved past one another, completely ignoring standard social etiquette in their desperate rush to reach the front door. The illusion of sophisticated high society grace vanished, entirely replaced by the ugly, chaotic reality of rats fleeing a sinking ship. Chloe snapped out of her frozen state of shock. She watched her entire social universe turning its back on her and running away. The country club friends she had spent years desperately trying to impress were currently trampling each other to get out of her house. "Wait!" she screamed, her voice cracking with hysterical, unhinged desperation. "Please wait. Do not leave. This is all a huge misunderstanding. The food is still coming. We have vintage champagne. Please, you cannot leave." She ran into the foyer, grabbing the arm of the country club president's wife. The older woman ripped her arm away from Chloe's grasp with an expression of absolute, profound revulsion. She looked at my daughter-in-law as if she were covered in something highly contagious and utterly toxic. "Do not ever contact me again," the woman hissed, turning her back and rushing out the front doors into the cool night air. Chloe stood in the center of her grand foyer, completely alone, her arms hanging limply at her sides. Her carefully constructed empire of vanity had been completely obliterated in less than 10 minutes. She was no longer a wealthy socialite. She was a broke, soon-to-be-indicted criminal suspect facing an eviction notice, standing in a house she did not own, watching her brother get shoved into the back of a police car. Her social death was absolute and irreversible. I remained standing at the far end of the long dining room table. I had not moved a single inch during the entire chaotic exodus. I stood perfectly still, watching the destruction unfold with the cold, unfeeling observation of an auditor reviewing a finalized ledger. Tom remained seated beside me, his hands still folded in his lap, quietly processing the sheer magnitude of the justice I had just delivered. The caterers had also realized the severe legal danger of the situation. We could hear them rapidly packing up their equipment in the kitchen, abandoning half-prepared dishes, and fleeing through the side doors to avoid being questioned by the police officers swarming the back patio. The mansion was completely empty now, save for Tom, myself, Chloe sobbing hysterically in the foyer, and my son. David was still standing near the head of the ruined dining table. His perfectly tailored suit looked rumpled. His face was slick with a cold, terrified sweat. He looked around the trashed room, taking in the overturned chairs, the spilled wine soaking into the floorboards, and the flashing red and blue lights pulsing relentlessly through the windows. He realized with devastating clarity that there was no escape, no magical financial bailout, and no way to rewind the clock. He slowly turned his head and looked down the length of the table at me. The arrogance he had carried for the past 6 months was completely gone. The smug, entitled posture of a man who thought he had successfully outsmarted his elderly parents had vanished. In its place was the pathetic, trembling demeanor of a cowardly child who had just been caught stealing. He stumbled away from his chair and began walking toward me. His steps were heavy and dragging. He stopped a few feet away, his chest heaving with panicked breaths. Mom, he choked out his voice, cracking tears welling up in his eyes. Mom, please, you have to stop this. You have to call your lawyers and fix this. The police are outside. Justin is arrested. Chloe is going to go to jail for that notary stamp. If my firm finds out about the fraudulent loans, I will be disbarred. I will lose my job. I will lose my license. I am going to lose everything. He dropped to his knees right there on the wine-stained floor. He reached out and tried to grab my hands, desperate to invoke the maternal weakness he had relied on his entire life. We made a mistake, he sobbed, the tears spilling over his cheeks. We got in too deep with the house payments, and Justin promised he could double the money if we just loaned it to him for a few months. We were going to put the retirement funds back. I swear to you, Mom, we were going to put it all back. You are my mother. You cannot do this to me. You cannot send your own son to federal prison. Please, Mom, you have to protect me. I looked down at the grown man kneeling in the spilled wine. I looked at the son I had carried, the boy I had raised, the child Tom and I had sacrificed our own comforts to provide for. I searched my heart for any lingering trace of maternal pity. I searched for the instinct to shield him from the brutal consequences of the world. I found absolutely nothing. The reservoir of my forgiveness was entirely dry. I did not reach down to comfort him. I did not pull him up from the floor. I slowly pulled my hands away from his desperate, grasping fingers, leaving him kneeling alone in the wreckage of his own making. I looked him dead in the eyes, my expression hardened into a mask of pure, unbreakable steel. I spent 35 years protecting assets, I said, my voice echoing coldly in the empty, ruined dining room. Did you really think I would not protect my own? The calendar on my kitchen wall flipped to October, marking exactly 6 months since the night the dining room emptied and the flashing police lights faded into the distance. Time possesses a remarkable ability to scrub away the chaos of human mistakes, leaving behind only the cold, hard facts of consequence. For half a year I had watched the grinding wheels of the American justice system process the people who tried to destroy my family. It is a slow, methodical machine, but once it locks onto a target, it does not stop until the ledger is completely balanced. Let us begin with the architect of the grand illusion. The federal government does not appreciate commercial real estate developers who use wire fraud to fund their lifestyles. Justin Miller learned this lesson in a sterile federal courtroom, completely devoid of the mahogany paneling and crystal chandeliers he so desperately loved. The trial was shockingly brief because the evidence was absolutely insurmountable. The glossy prospectuses he had handed me in his flashy office became the premier exhibits for the prosecution. The financial records detailing the commingling of stolen residential equity with fraudulent commercial investments left his defense attorneys with absolutely nothing to say. Justin traded his bespoke tailored suits for a standard-issue federal prison uniform. He was sentenced to 85 months in a federal correctional institution for orchestrating a multi-million-dollar Ponzi scheme. The arrogant smirk he wore while bragging about his financial brilliance is gone forever. He will spend the next 7 years of his life taking orders from correctional officers and sitting in a concrete cell, contemplating the fact that his entire empire was dismantled by a retired bank manager holding a simple leather briefcase. His sister proved that loyalty among thieves is nothing more than a convenient myth. The very morning after the disastrous birthday dinner, Chloe filed for divorce. She packed her designer clothes into expensive luggage and abandoned my son without a single backward glance. She genuinely believed she could sever herself from David and legally isolate herself from the collapsing wreckage of their life. She hired a high-priced divorce attorney and attempted to paint herself as a clueless, innocent housewife who had no idea where the money was coming from. She severely underestimated the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The federal government does not care about country club memberships or social standing. They care about physical evidence, and I had provided them with the ultimate smoking gun. 3 weeks after she filed for divorce, federal agents arrived at her rented luxury apartment. They did not come to ask polite questions. They came with an indictment. Chloe was formally charged with federal notary fraud and conspiracy to commit embezzlement. The state licensing board permanently revoked her notary commission. The blue stamp she had so arrogantly pressed onto a $250,000 loan document became the exact instrument of her destruction. Her social exile was immediate and absolute. The wealthy elite friends she had spent years desperately trying to impress abandoned her overnight. The country club quietly revoked her membership. The women who used to drink her imported wine and admire her expensive handbags now pretend they do not even know her name. She is currently awaiting trial out on bail and facing a mandatory minimum sentence that will ensure she never touches a piece of financial paperwork for the rest of her natural life. She wanted to live like royalty, but she built her castle on a foundation of federal felonies. Then there is my son. Mothers are supposed to possess an endless well of forgiveness for their children. Society tells us that blood is thicker than water and that a parent must always keep the door open. But when a child looks you in the eye while methodically draining the lifeblood from the father who raised him, that door does not just close, it seals shut permanently. David lost everything. The high-paying corporate job he relied on to maintain his pretentious facade fired him the moment the wire fraud investigation became public knowledge. Corporate firms do not employ executives entangled in federal banking scandals. Without his salary and without his wife, he was left completely adrift. He currently lives in a cramped 300-square-foot studio apartment on the industrial side of the city. He found employment managing a mid-level retail store, working long, exhausting hours just to keep the lights on. But his paycheck does not belong entirely to him. Because I held the legally binding debt acknowledgement and promissory note that Chloe had so eagerly signed, I secured a total wage garnishment through the civil courts. Every single time David receives his meager retail paycheck, a significant percentage is automatically deducted and routed directly into my primary banking account. He will spend the next 15 years of his life quietly paying back the financial damage he caused. Every dollar he earns is a constant, inescapable reminder that he chose his pride over his family and lost them both. With the criminals properly processed, I turned my attention to the business of financial recovery. Buying the foreclosed mansion on the courthouse steps had been a necessary tactical strike to secure my assets, but I had absolutely no desire to maintain ownership of that sprawling, pretentious property. It was a monument to fake wealth, and I wanted it liquidated immediately. I hired a ruthless, no-nonsense real estate agent who specialized in high-end suburban properties. We did not bother staging the house with expensive rented furniture. We completely emptied the property, stripping away every lingering trace of Chloe and David. We put the empty, pristine mansion on the market at a highly competitive price. The real estate market in that specific zip code was exceptionally aggressive. Within 4 days of listing the property, we triggered a massive bidding war among genuine wealthy buyers. The house sold for a significant premium far above the discounted price I had paid at the county foreclosure auction. The day the funds cleared the escrow account, I sat in my home office and experienced the profound satisfaction of a perfectly balanced ledger. I used the proceeds from the property sale to completely clear the hard money commercial loan I had taken out to win the auction. I then routed the exact amount of the stolen funds, precisely $400,000, back into the primary retirement account it had been taken from. Finally, I paid off the fraudulent home equity line of credit, wiping the $250,000 lien entirely off the title of my own home. When the dust settled and the final wire transfers were confirmed, the math was undeniably beautiful. Not only had I completely restored our stolen retirement savings and secured the safety of our home, but the massive profit margin from flipping the foreclosed mansion left Tom and me with a comfortable surplus of over $200,000. We were significantly wealthier than we had been before the theft even occurred. The financial bleeding was stopped. The wounds were closed. The fortress was rebuilt stronger than ever before. Which brings me to today. It is a quiet Sunday morning. The autumn air is crisp and completely still. I am sitting on the back deck of my home. The deed to this property is sitting in my fireproof safe, completely free and clear of any unauthorized debt. The wood beneath my feet belongs entirely to me. I am holding a ceramic mug of hot black coffee. Resting on the patio table in front of me is a stack of freshly printed monthly bank statements. I have spent the last 30 minutes reviewing every single line item, every routing number, and every interest yield. The balances are robust and secure. Every single cent is perfectly accounted for. I look out across the sprawling green expanse of our backyard. Tom is out there kneeling in the damp soil of his prized rose garden. He is wearing his faded denim overalls and his thick canvas gloves. The morning dew is clinging to his gray hair. He is carefully pruning the bushes, his hands moving with the gentle, practiced rhythm of a man who has spent 4 decades nurturing living things. He is humming a quiet tune to himself, completely at peace. The heavy, crushing sorrow that had weighed down his shoulders 6 months ago is entirely gone. He knows that his home is safe. He knows that his labor was not in vain. He knows that the woman he married possesses the strength to protect him from absolutely any threat that enters our lives. I watch my husband work, feeling a surge of profound, enduring love. Life has a way of testing the foundations we build. People will tell you that family is the most important thing in the world. They will tell you that trust is a given, that love is unconditional, and that blood ties should override all other considerations. They will expect you to soften your edges, to forgive the unforgivable, and to quietly absorb the damage inflicted by the people who are supposed to care for you the most. Do not listen to them. Love is a beautiful, vital part of the human experience. It brings warmth to our homes and joy to our years. But love is not a substitute for boundaries. Love does not give anyone the right to dismantle your security. Trust is a magnificent gift, but it must be earned and it must be constantly verified. You can love your children with your entire heart. You can support their dreams, celebrate their successes, and offer them a safe harbor when the world is cruel. But you must never allow your maternal instincts to blind you to the reality of their actions. When someone shows you that their greed is greater than their gratitude, you must believe them the very first time. You must never apologize for demanding respect, and you must never feel guilty for enforcing the consequences of a betrayal. We spend our entire lives working, saving, and sacrificing to build a sliver of peace for our later years. Protect that peace with the ferocity of a predator. Do not let arrogance intimidate you. Do not let false tears manipulate you. And do not ever assume that a pleasant smile means a clean conscience. Enjoy your family. Cherish your spouses, plant your gardens, and drink your coffee in the quiet morning air. But when the coffee is finished and the house is quiet, sit down at your desk, open your laptop, and check your bank statements. Check them thoroughly, check them ruthlessly, because the only person who will ever